Our opening thought comes from Bill McKibben, who recently published a book with the title that is the title of one of my favorite songs, which we heard the instrumental version there, Here Comes the Sun. McKibben writes, "We are on the verge of realizing that the sun, which already provides us light and warmth and photosynthesis, is also willing to provide us the power we need to run our lives. We are on the verge of turning to the heavens for energy instead of to hell. It won't happen automatically, and I don't know if we will do it, at least in the short window physics is giving us to deal with climate change." Our next reading also comes from Bill McKibben's Here Comes the Sun. Sometime in the early part of the 2020s, we crossed an invisible line where the cost of producing energy from the sun dropped below the cost of fossil fuel. That's not yet common knowledge. We still think of photovoltaic panels and wind turbines as, quote, alternative energy, end quote, as if they were the whole foods of power, nice but pricey. In fact, and more so with each passing month, they are the Costco of energy, inexpensive and available in bulk. Our next reading also comes from Bill McKibben, Here Comes the Sun. My point here is that precisely because the conversion to things like heat pumps and electric vehicles would cut energy use so dramatically, the fossil fuel industry is going all out to make sure it doesn't happen. In fact, the entire point of the industry by this point in its history is to make sure we keep burning something. It's desperate, as we shall see, to slow down this switch by any means necessary, sometimes by bribing Instagram influencers, more often by buying political influence. It seizes on any event, the rise of AI, the fall of Ukraine, to insist that we prolong the life of its products. Take a stroll down climate change memory lane with me for a moment. The year is 1988. And in addition to being the year I graduated from college, it is also the year that the climate scientist and director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, by the name of James Hansen, was invited by Rafe Pomerantz of the World Resources Institute to testify before the United States Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources on June 23rd, 1988. James Hansen looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. He was shy. He was unassuming. He did not like public speaking. He did not like being on TV. He did not like being interviewed on TV. He was nervous. He was anxious, but he spoke forth, and this is part of what he said in his testimony. And keep in mind that this was over 37 years ago. Global warming has reached a level such that we can ascribe with a high degree of confidence a cause and effect relationship between the greenhouse effect and observed warming. It is already happening now. The greenhouse effect has been detected, and it is changing our climate now. We already reached the point where the greenhouse effect is important. And he went on to say that NASA was 99% confident that the warming was caused by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and not a random fluctuation. 1988. Those of us who were around in the 80s might recall that the world was fresh off of a successful global effort to address environmental damage from another source, and that was to address damage to the ozone layer. That had led, and this effort to address this damage led to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer in 1987. It was a bipartisan effort here in the United States. It was an effort across the political spectrum around the world. Maggie Thatcher was one of the key global leaders in moving the world forward towards the Montreal Protocol. It was a great global success, and we are reaping the benefits of that Montreal Protocol today as the ozone layer has been healing over the decades since. So right after that global success in 1987 with dealing with the depletion of the ozone layer, there was actually initially here in the United States bipartisan support for responding to the threat of climate change. In fact, in 1988, while campaigning for president, George H.W. Bush, Bush the Elder, he even said this, quote, "Those who think we are powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect forget about the White House effect. As president, I intend to do something about it." And then, on the 20th anniversary of Earth Day in 1990, that anniversary was met with great enthusiasm and commitment to care for the environment and urgently address the problem of climate change. And the United Nations was taking the lead during this time. They still are. They were taking the lead then to organize global efforts to promote ecological sustainability and to avoid catastrophic climate change. And that led to the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. A lot of things happening between 1988 and 1992 to begin to address climate change, to move towards preserving a livable climate. Although I had a great appreciation for nature since my early childhood, it was during this time, between 1988 and 1992, that I became immersed in the environmental movement and began focusing my studies, my master's studies, and then my doctoral studies on theological, philosophical, and practical responses to our global ecological challenges, including the threat of catastrophic climate change. It was during this time that I read the ecological theology of a fellow United Methodist process theologian. I've mentioned him before to you, John B. Cobb Jr. I read a lot of his work that was really groundbreaking in bringing persons of different religions to realize the urgency of the threat that we were facing in relation to the environment and our misuse, mistreatment of it. I also read a report of the United Nations Brundtland Commission. Brundtland was the Prime Minister of Norway, and she led this Brundtland Commission. And they published a report titled Our Common Future in 1987. I also read the political reflections on how to address climate change found in Al Gore's 1992 book. Most people remember the later work that he did, An Inconvenient Truth, but all the way back in 1992, he wrote a book titled Earth in the Balance. Earth in the Balance. So reading those works, focusing some of my own attention and my studies on the global ecological challenges that we were facing, that was the time where I really became involved in trying to systematically do something about what we are doing to the environment. That was 1988 to 1992. But in 1992, something had changed. When you compare 1988 to 1992, something had changed. The bipartisan commitment to address the threat of climate change that was emerging in 1988 had been greatly diminished by 1992. As climate scientists were reaching global consensus about the causes of climate change and the urgent need to address the climate crisis, fossil fuel companies were also coming to their own consensus that it was in their financial interests to deny the reality of climate change as long as possible and to spend billions of dollars spreading misinformation and disinformation about climate change and influencing politicians through donations and lobbying to promote fossil fuel interests in order to protect the trillions of dollars in assets that they owned, that were still in the ground, and that could only make them money if they were extracted and burned. The greenhouse effect and the promised White House effect to address it were becoming overshadowed by the greenback effect, fueled by the greed of the fossil fuel industry. By 1992, it was becoming very clear that the needed transition away from fossil fuels would not happen smoothly. It would not happen without a struggle. It would not happen without a fight with the fossil fuel companies and their oligarch executives who were determined to extract and cash in on their hydrocarbon assets, even if it meant hurling human civilization towards climate chaos. Tragically, the fossil fuel industry, with its vast resources and political influence, has been immensely successful at keeping humanity from doing what we ought to do to address the existential threat to human civilization that is posed by climate change. They have managed to keep humanity slow-walking the urgent energy transition that is needed to preserve a livable climate for all. There are few people on Earth that I know of who have done more to take up the necessary fight against the propaganda of the fossil fuel industry than Bill McKibben. Bill McKibben, by the way, is also a United Methodist. There's some of us United Methodists who are doing work in this area. He was a United Methodist Sunday school teacher for many years at a small United Methodist church in Vermont. He wrote the first book on climate change for a general audience. It was titled The End of Nature, and it was published in 1989, just a year after James Hansen's testimony before the Senate committee in 1988. Bill McKibben is founder of an organization called Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 for action on climate and justice. Just one more year for me before I can get my membership. And after his 1989 book, The End of Nature, he went on to write 20 books. And his work appears regularly in periodicals from The New Yorker to Rolling Stone. He serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College in Vermont. He's won the Gandhi Peace Prize as well as honorary degrees from 20 colleges and universities. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. He also helped found 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, which has organized protests on every continent, and yes, that includes Antarctica, for climate action. He played a leading role in launching the opposition to big oil pipeline projects like the Keystone XL pipeline and the fossil fuel divestment campaign. which has become so successful that it's become the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history, with endowments worth more than $40 trillion stepping back from oil, gas, and coal. Bill McKibben has been on the front lines of this battle for our climate future for decades. And he is not known for being particularly optimistic about where we are headed. In fact, he's more known for his dark realism, as he lays out in sometimes very frightening detail what will happen if we don't do what we must do to avoid climate chaos. After all, optimists do not tend to title a book "The End of Nature." But Bill McKibben, the dark realist, is non-characteristically optimistic in his most recent book, Here Comes the Sun, a last chance for the climate and a fresh chance for civilization. He notes in this new publication that advances in the production capacity and in the efficiency of solar power have brought us to a watershed moment in which solar and wind power and the battery storage technology that's needed to support them have reached the point where it's significantly less expensive to use these forms of energy rather than fossil fuels. Now, I realize that those of us from Oklahoma and Texas may not be able to see that clearly, because actually in Texas, you've done a lot in Texas in relation to solar and wind power, more in relation to solar and wind power than in Oklahoma. But the incentives have not been there in these big fossil fuel states in relation to renewable energy. But it is the case that when you look at it globally now, sometime in the early 2020s, we crossed that invisible line where the cost of solar and wind is now significantly less expensive to use than the forms of energy that come from fossil fuels. We now have the technological ability and the production capacity. A lot of that production capacity is not happening here in the United States. It's happening in China. But globally, we now have the production capacity to power the planet with solar and wind and to transition away from the fossil fuels that we're currently using at the pace that is needed to avoid catastrophic climate change. And there's no compelling reason not to do this. One of the only things keeping us from doing this is the fact that the fossil fuel companies still want to make those trillions of dollars off of their yet to be exploited fossil fuel assets that are still in the ground. The two main things keeping us from a renewable energy future and a livable climate are greed and the lack of political will that is reinforced by that greed. One of the great advantages of solar and wind power is that its use in distributed forms, because it can be used in distributed ways. Put it on your rooftop, have turbine on your land, things of that nature. It doesn't have to be concentrated in the hands of big utility companies. And this great advantage is one of the main reasons fossil fuel companies are doing all they can to resist the needed transition. The good news, the really excellent news, is that we are seeing significant signs of the needed transition happening around the world in spite of the efforts by fossil fuel companies to stop it. The low cost and efficiency of solar and wind power and the battery storage technology that are needed to support it are such that it no longer makes sense to develop an economy using fossil fuels. The time to leapfrog fossil fuels in favor of solar and wind in developing economies has come. It's here, it's now, and it's actually happening. I invite you to look at Pakistan as an example, where they've moved to about 30% of their power now coming from solar, using inexpensive solar panels coming from, guess where? China. I invite you to look at countries in Africa and villages all over Africa that are creating mini grids. There's about over 3,000 of them now. And it would only cost about $90 billion total to have enough mini grids in Africa to power the continent, which is chump change. Not very much when you look at the overall amount of money that the oligarchs in the world control. Now, yes, like all forms of energy, there are environmental costs to solar and wind power and the batteries that are needed to support them. McKibben realizes this, he notes it. He says we need lithium, copper, rare earth minerals like neodymium. I'm just guessing on the pronunciation of that. These are the elements that allow sunlight and wind to be translated into energy we can use. He also notes that this requires mining. It requires refining. There's going to be a cobalt refinery about 2 miles from my boyhood home in Lawton, Oklahoma. I'm a little bit worried about it, but it's part of the process for creating the resources that are needed for this shift. So it does require some environmental impact. But here's the point that he really focuses on, and I think it's the point to really focus on. When you compare this impact with the overall impact of fossil fuels, there is really no comparison when it comes to the overwhelmingly more negative consequences of continuing to extract and to burn fossil fuels. And not only that, technology and advances don't just stop, right? The technological advances in relation to wind, solar, and batteries is continuing to develop. And we're seeing also more ability to recycle batteries as well, so that the need for mining, they've really done some research on this lately, the need for mining will actually decrease rather than increase over time. And the recent breakthroughs in the use of sodium, maybe you've read that in the news lately, they're being able to use sodium for batteries. That is a truly significant breakthrough. There's a lot of sodium on the planet. It's everywhere. And China is taking the lead in this. They have really been the country that has made the breakthroughs on the use of sodium for batteries, and now other countries are following suit. I've known Bill McKibben for decades. We've emailed back and forth for decades. He's helped me feel encouraged even in the worst times when it looks like we're just not going to be able to do what we need to be doing in relation to the environment. So even though he has that dark realism side to him, he's also one to encourage others to keep going forward and do all that can be done. But I know that he does not shy away from telling it like it is. He will definitely tell it like it is. And if recent developments in solar and wind and battery technology are making a dark realist like Bill McKibben feel optimistic about our climate future, then I am listening. And I'm hopeful that here comes the sun to save us, to save a livable climate for us all. That is, if we can break away from the hold that a fossil-fueled fascism currently has over our country. May we all find the courage and commitment to do all we can to let the sun come in. Hear this poem from Susie Castle from Rise Up and Salute the Sun. Everything turns, rotates, spins, circles, loops, pulsates, resonates, and repeats. Circles of life, born from pulses of light, vibrate to breathe while spiraling outwards for infinity, through the lens of time and into a sea of stars and lucid dreams.